Sometimes people go into a coma, and when they wake up, it turns out that they missed the time somehow. That's what happened to my grandfather. He had a stroke, spent 3 weeks in a coma. He woke up, and then bam, he forgot English, only spoke Chok. You know, Chok is a local language. I used to communicate with guys there. I used to play with him when I was a kid. He used to speak Chok fluently. But then he forgot. He lived his life. He couldn't remember a word. Yes, that's right. For about 10 days he didn't speak a word of English there, and then he woke up from a nightmare and immediately remembered English, remembering nothing in Chok. And, you know, I also learnt about a dude who, after the coma, started speaking Cantonese. And then he got back together with his Chinese girl. That's the kind of story that's unusual. And then there was this other thing. I was in a coma for 4 days, and when I came out of it, everyone was talking about my baby. I lost my memory, and it turns out I don't remember my pregnant wife. We had a son in intensive care. I didn't even know. And when he woke up, he couldn't breathe. The artificial respiration machine was switched on. I had to learn how to breathe all over again. It was scary, you know, to learn to breathe by myself. Well, yes. And I also remembered about a friend who had septicemia after surgery. After the coma, his hair grew back, but his brain was still damaged. It seems he was always in the slightest rotation, dizzy, but thank God he survived, although he had to learn a lot of things all over again. I also remembered an interesting story. I had a colleague at work. Here's a story with him too. In a coma, he did nothing but talk in a foreign language like Spanish. And then, when he woke up, suddenly forgot all the programming code, even though he knew it as a pro before. But the interesting thing is that his memory did come back, but gradually. It was as if the puzzles in his head were all coming back to the right place. That's what happens. And here's another thing that struck me. My grandfather was in a coma for a while because of a heart attack. When he woke up, he suddenly started painting, and he'd never even held a brush before. Nobody in the family knew he could do that. It turned out that in the coma it was like he was reborn. I also remembered how one of my acquaintances started to compose poetry after the coma. He'd never been interested in it before, but then suddenly it was as if he'd found his calling. And I have the saddest story I've ever seen in this thread. Oh my God, that's just awful. Imagine, the man must have felt it was a punishment for something terrible. My wife was in an induced coma for a fortnight for medical reasons. And when she woke up, she had false memories, all based on conversations that took place in her room. For example, she thought she flew to Washington for treatment while she was in a coma. My father was talking about how he had just returned from a work trip to Washington. And somehow she overheard that while she was out. Her brain somehow interpreted it to mean she flew to DC. Even after we explained to her the reality of where she was, it took a few days for her to come to terms with reality. My brother-in-law had a brain tumor, so he was out for a while. When he was first admitted to the hospital, the nurses were of Asian descent. So when he woke up, he apologized to people for making them come to Japan to see him. A relative of a friend of mine was in a coma for about 3 weeks. When he woke up, he couldn't find his teeth. Everyone had completely forgotten where they had been put, searching for a whole week. At one point, he collapsed at the hospital sink, out of nowhere, out of the blue. They resuscitated him, but they couldn't figure out why he could barely breathe. Then the doctors showed him the x-rays. Turns out the false teeth were inside him. They forgot to take them out when they put the tubes in his mouth, which caused the air supply to be cut off or something. So yeah, they found the teeth. I was in a coma for 4 days from bacterial meningitis. When I woke up, I was completely deaf. I had to communicate with my parents and doctors with a notepad and a pen. Somehow, gradually, my hearing returned to my left ear, but my right ear still doesn't work 100% to this day. My father had a reaction to contrast dye after a head injury. There were seizures. It was like a brain reboot. He could only say, like a girl. My sister had just been born at the time. He couldn't hold things, couldn't grab things. Spent a few months in therapy. Eventually his mood changed. He became very testy, a little impatient and very sleepy. He is fine now except for some pain in his neck. About 20 years ago, my cousin suffered a serious head injury after a fall. He was in his early 20s at the time. He was in a coma for almost 4 weeks. When he woke up, he discovered pretty quickly that he had a perfect memory. He could recount any conversation word for word and could even tell you the date and time you said something. He could also memorize an image in just a few seconds. His memory is still perfect. It's annoying as hell. Whenever he reminds me of something I've said in the past, usually something I can't even remember, I suggest smashing him over the head again. Looking at what happened last time he got hit in the head, he'll probably just get another superpower. Best not to risk trying to fix him. It's just not working correctly. You have to switch it off and then switch it back on again. I had diabetic ketoacidosis, and it eventually sent me into a coma. I have vague memories of being sick. The general sense of time was just like mush. Even years later, I can't establish a proper timeline. I have flashes of memories of different doctors coming in and out of the room. Once I came out of the coma, I was still out of it. Once on an insulin drip, the doctors would check my sugar every hour. I was never able to fall asleep, but the whole time I felt like I was asleep. It's hard to describe the feeling, just a mushy stretch of time. I was in a coma for almost 6 weeks when I woke up. Once I got to the hospital, and I don't remember well what the paramedics and hospital staff told me, but the gist of it is that I was hit or swept off the road by a drunk driver in order to cross 3 lanes to get to the exit ramp, which is where I was. Basically ended up in his blind spot at the wrong time, on top of him being very drunk. It felt like I was teleporting or time traveling because 1 minute I'm driving and the next I'm smashed in a bloody mess. I'm in a hospital bed with a staple in my back and neck, airbag gas burns, an IV in my arm, and a few other injuries. When I woke up, I was in a completely different world from that one. So here I was, lying in the hospital, and the world around me just kept spinning. I couldn't believe I had missed so much time. Everything seemed so unreal, like I had disappeared in time. Doctors, nurses, it was like a film. I remember being surrounded by questions and being confused trying to remember what had happened. But the worst part was when I realized I couldn't move anymore. At first it was like a nightmare when you wake up and realize you can't move a finger. I remembered trying to convince myself that it was a dream, but the pain and reality slapped me in the face. And then my struggle to make every little bit of progress began. 3 weeks seems like an eternity when you can't lift a hand or take a step on your own. It was a time when every little movement was a victory. I remember patiently working out, trying to regain a modicum of control over my body. But even worse was the realization that much of my memory was gone. Like a painting in pieces, my memories were becoming more and more blurred and inaccessible. It was like trying to put together a puzzle without some of its pieces. And that's just a small piece of what I experienced. A coma is not just a loss of time, it's a test of survival. Like a fight for every breath, every movement. And when you wake up, you realize you're not the same person you were before. But you know what? You're still alive. Some people, after returning from a coma, talk about the strange memories and visions they had during the unconscious state. They may have seen bright lights or experienced strange scenes that seemed real to them, but which they couldn't explain when they woke up. In the world of medical miracles, incredible things happen. And one of the most amazing is the ability of the human body to survive the most severe conditions, such as coma, and still come back to life. For those who have survived a coma, this resurrection can be just as amazing as the very state they were in. Many of them talk about the impressions and experiences they had when they woke up from this deep sleep.